You still remember me, kid?" The man in the worn work clothes stood across the street, grease-stained hands trembling slightly as Elvis Presley stepped out of his Cadillac in downtown Memphis. For a moment, Elvis couldn't place him. The gray hair, the weathered face, the defeated posture were so different from the strong, confident electrician who had taught a 19-year-old Elvis how to wire a circuit back in 1954. But then recognition hit like lightning. Vernon Matthews," Elvis whispered, his voice catching. The man who had taught him that honest work was the foundation of everything. Who had stayed late without pay to train him. Who had told him, "You're special, kid, but never forget where you came from," was now standing on a Memphis street corner looking like a man who had lost everything. But to understand how a rock and roll legend ended up face to face with his old mentor on a random Tuesday afternoon in 1974, and why what happened next would remain secret for decades, you need to know about the electrician who saw potential in a truck driver with dreams bigger than his paycheck. It was April 1954, and 19-year-old Elvis Presley had just started working at Memphis Power and Light Company, making exactly $1 an hour driving a supply truck. He was nobody. Just another poor kid from Tupelo, trying to make ends meet, spending his days delivering electrical supplies to job sites around Memphis, and his nights dreaming about the music career that seemed impossibly far away. Vernon Matthews was 42 years old and had been working as a master electrician for 20 years. He was the kind of man who believed in honest work, in doing things right, in passing down knowledge to the next generation. When he first met Elvis, he saw something familiar. A young man who was poor but proud, struggling but determined, exactly like Vernon had been at that age. "You're the new truck driver?" Vernon had asked that first day, watching as Elvis carefully unloaded supplies at a construction site. "Yes, sir," Elvis replied quietly. He was always quiet back then, almost painfully shy, especially around men like Vernon who seemed to have their lives figured out. Vernon noticed how carefully Elvis handled the equipment, how he double-checked everything, how he asked questions when he wasn't sure about something. Most young drivers just threw stuff off the truck and left, but this kid seemed to actually care about doing the job right. "You ever think about learning a trade?" Vernon asked one day after Elvis had been working there for a few weeks. "Electrician's a good profession, steady work, decent pay, better than driving a truck your whole life." Elvis looked down at his hand. "I don't know if I'm smart enough for that kind of work, Mr. Matthews." Vernon studied the young man for a moment. "Smart's got nothing to do with it. It's about being willing to learn, willing to work hard, willing to do things right even when nobody's watching. You got those things?" "I think so, sir." "Then you're smart enough." That was the beginning of something that would shape Elvis Presley in ways that had nothing to do with music. For the next 6 months, Vernon Matthews stayed after his shift ended, unpaid, to teach Elvis basic electrical skill. He showed him how to wire circuits, how to read electrical diagrams, how to troubleshoot problems, how to work safely. But more than that, Vernon taught Elvis about dignity in work, about the value of craftsmanship, about what it meant to be a man who kept his word and did his job right. "Listen to me, Elvis," Vernon said one evening as they were working late on a practice panel. "You got something special about you. I can see it. You're going somewhere, kid, but I want you to remember something, and I want you to remember it for the rest of your life." Elvis looked up from the wiring he was working on. "What's that, Mr. Matthews?" "Honest work. That's all a man's got, really. You can have all the talent in the world, all the luck, all the success, but if you don't understand the value of honest work, if you lose respect for the people who do the hard jobs that keep the world running, you'll lose yourself. Never forget where you came from, Elvis. Never forget the people who helped you when you were nothing." Elvis nodded slowly. "I won't, sir. I promise." "And another thing," Vernon continued, pulling out his worn company patch from his pocket. "See this? I've worn this patch for 20 years. It means I'm part of something bigger than myself. It means I do work that matters. Don't ever let anyone tell you that working with your hands isn't noble. Some of the greatest men I've ever known were electricians, plumbers, carpenters. They built things. They fixed things. They made the world work. That's dignity, son." In July 1954, something happened that would change everything. Elvis had finally saved enough money to record a demo at Sun Studio. He was terrified, convinced he wasn't good enough, ready to give up before he even started. Vernon noticed his young apprentice's anxiety. "What's eating you, kid?" Elvis told him about the recording session, about his dreams of being a singer, about his fear that he was fooling himself. Vernon put down his tools and looked Elvis in the eye. "Let me tell you something about fear, Elvis. Fear is just your mind telling you that something matters to you. The only people who aren't afraid are the people who don't care about anything. You're afraid because this means something to you. That's good. That means you'll work hard at it. That means you'll respect it. But what if I'm not good enough? Then you learn and you get better. Same as anything else. Same as wiring a circuit. First time I did electrical work, I was terrible, but I kept at it. I learned. I got better. You will too." Elvis went to that recording session, and everything changed. Within months, he had recorded "That's Alright" and was on his way to becoming a professional musician. But he never forgot Vernon Matthews, and he never forgot the lessons about honest work and staying humble. In October 1954, Elvis came to the shop one last time to officially quit his job. Vernon was genuinely happy for him. "You're going to be big, kid. I can feel it. But remember what I taught you. Remember where you came from." "I will, Mr. Matthews. I promise. And when I make it big, I'm going to pay you back for all those hours you spent teaching me." Vernon shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, Elvis. Passing on knowledge, that's what we're supposed to do. Just promise me you'll do the same someday. Help someone else the way I helped you." 20 years passed. Elvis became exactly what Vernon had predicted. Big, bigger than either of them could have imagined. The shy truck driver became the king of rock and roll, a global superstar, one of the most famous people on earth. And Vernon Matthews? He kept working every day, for 20 more years, wearing his company patch with pride, doing honest work, training young apprentices, just like he'd trained Elvis, believing that hard work and loyalty would be rewarded with security and dignity in his retirement. But the world was changing. Companies were modernizing, cutting costs, eliminating older workers. In 1973, at age 61, after 40 years of loyal service to Memphis Power and Light Company, Vernon Matthews was laid off. Downsizing, they called it. Modernization. The younger guys with college degrees could do the same work for less money, and Vernon's experience didn't matter anymore. His pension, which he'd been counting on, turned out to be much smaller than promised. Some corporate restructuring, some financial complications, some fine print he'd never understood. After 40 years of putting money into the system, he was getting barely enough to cover rent on a tiny apartment. At 61, he was too old to be hired anywhere else. Every job application came back with polite rejections. At 61, he was too young for full Social Security benefits. He was caught in a bureaucratic nightmare. Too old to work, too young to retire, with savings that were evaporating faster than he could believe. He started selling his tools, the good ones, the ones he'd accumulated over 4 decades of work, the ones that represented his entire career, gone, piece by piece, to pawn shops, just to pay rent and buy food. He started looking for day labor, standing in lines at construction sites with men half his age, hoping someone would hire him for cash work. Sometimes they did. Most times they did. That's where things stood on that Tuesday afternoon in October 1974, when Elvis Presley stepped out of his Cadillac in downtown Memphis and heard a voice he hadn't heard in 20 years. "You still remember me, kid?" Elvis turned and saw Vernon standing there, and his heart broke. The strong, confident man who had taught him about dignity and honest work was now wearing a company uniform that didn't fit anymore, standing in front of a pawn shop, looking like someone who had been beaten down by life. "Vernon? Vernon Matthews?" Elvis crossed the street quickly. "My God, what happened to you?" Vernon tried to smile, but it didn't quite work. "Life happened, Elvis. Company let me go last year. Modernization, they said. 40 years don't count for much anymore." Elvis looked at the pawn shop behind Vernon, at the worn toolbox in his hands. You're not selling your tools, are you?" Vernon looked down. "Got to eat, kid. Got to pay rent." "This is wrong," Elvis said, his voice tight with anger. "This is all wrong. You gave 40 years to that company. You taught guys like me. You made that company work. How can they just throw you away?" "That's how it is now," Vernon said quietly. Loyalty don't mean what it used to. Hard work don't guarantee nothing anymore. Elvis's mind was racing. The man who had taught him about dignity was being stripped of his own dignity. The man who had told him to never forget where he came from was being forgotten by everyone. This wasn't right. This couldn't stand. Vernon, where are you living? Little apartment over on Harmon Street. Month to month. Probably going to lose it soon though. Behind on rent. And you're selling your tools to pay rent? Vernon nodded. Don't need them anyway. Nobody's hiring 61-year-old electricians. These tools, they're all I got left of 40 years of work. Figured they should at least help keep me alive a little longer. Elvis made a decision in that moment. Standing on that Memphis street corner, Vernon Matthews had taught him about honest work, about dignity, about never forgetting where you came from. Now it was time to prove he'd learned those lessons. But Elvis knew Vernon. The man was proud. If Elvis just handed him money, Vernon would refuse it. If Elvis offered charity, Vernon would walk away. This had to be done carefully, quietly, in a way that would preserve Vernon's dignity while giving him what he needed. Vernon, you still good at electrical work? Best electrician in Memphis, kid. Always was. Just nobody wants to pay for best anymore when they can get cheap. I need an electrician, Elvis said, the plan forming in his mind. Graceland's got electrical problems. Old house, old wiring, always something going wrong. How'd you like to be my personal electrician? Keep the whole place maintained. Fix problems when they come up? Vernon looked suspicious. Elvis, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm serious. Elvis interrupted. You think I trust just anybody to work on my home? I need someone I know, someone I trust, someone who taught me what honest work means. That's you, Vernon. Always was. I don't need charity, Elvis. This ain't charity. This is business. This is me hiring the best electrician I know because I don't want my house burning down. You'd be doing me a favor. Vernon studied Elvis's face for a long moment. What's it pay? Elvis named a figure that was more than Vernon had made in his best year at Memphis Power and Light. Vernon's eyes widened. That's too much, That ain't fair pay for. That's exactly fair pay for the best electrician in Memphis. Take it or leave it, Vernon. But I'm not negotiating. You taught me never to undervalue good work. Well, your good work. Vernon's hands were shaking. I don't know what to say. Say yes, and say you'll let me advance you first month's salary right now so you can get caught up on that rent and get your tools back from whatever pawn shop you were about to sell them to. And that's what happened. Vernon Matthews became Elvis Presley's personal electrician, with a salary that ensured he would never have to worry about rent or food again. But Elvis didn't stop there. Working through his manager and his team, Elvis quietly orchestrated something far more elaborate. He spent the next week tracking down every pawn shop in Memphis, finding out which ones had Vernon's tools. One by one, he bought them back. The wire strippers Vernon had owned for 30 years. The voltage tester he'd used on 1,000 jobs. The specialized tools that represented decades of accumulated expertise. Each tool had a story, represented a moment in Vernon's career, symbolized his identity as a craftsman. But Elvis knew he couldn't just show up with all these tools. Vernon would know something was wrong, would suspect charity, would refuse. So Elvis had them delivered to Graceland as company equipment, tools that the house's electrician would need to properly maintain such a large property. He even had new cases made for them, professional-grade equipment boxes that made it look like Graceland was investing in proper tools for its maintenance staff. Joe Esposito, Elvis's manager, watched this elaborate operation unfold with amazement. Elvis, you're spending more time on this than on your next album, Joe observed one evening, as Elvis reviewed another set of financial arrangements. Joe, you don't understand, Elvis replied, his voice intense. Vernon Matthews taught me everything that matters. Not the music stuff. Anybody could have taught me that. But Vernon taught me about being a man, about dignity, about never forgetting where you come from. If I can't help him now, when he needs it most, then I didn't learn anything. Elvis contacted a lawyer to look into Vernon's pension situation. What he discovered made him furious. The company had restructured right before Vernon's retirement, technically creating a new corporation that wasn't responsible for the old pension promises. It was legal, barely, but it was wrong. Vernon had been counting on that pension for 40 years, and through financial sleight of hand, it had been reduced to almost nothing. Elvis couldn't sue the company without exposing Vernon to the humiliation of a public legal battle, and even if he won, it would take years. So he did something else. He created a pension adjustment fund. Through a series of shell corporations and insurance policies that looked like they were correcting bureaucratic errors in Vernon's pension. Every month, Vernon would receive what looked like a corrected pension payment, properly calculated for his 40 years of service. Vernon never knew these payments were coming from Elvis's personal accounts, carefully laundered through enough legal entities to make them look like corporate corrections. Then came the housing situation. Elvis knew Vernon's tiny apartment was barely livable, knew the landlord was about to evict him, knew Vernon was 1 month away from homelessness. But he also knew Vernon's pride wouldn't accept a gift of a house. Elvis found a small but well-maintained house about 10 minutes from Graceland, in a decent working-class neighborhood where Vernon would feel comfortable. He bought it through a shell corporation, then approached Vernon with what seemed like a business proposition. "Vernon, this house near Graceland. It's company property, part of the estate's holdings. We need someone living there, someone we trust, someone who can respond quickly if there's an electrical emergency at Graceland. Would you consider it? The rent would be nominal, just enough to cover basic maintenance costs. Think of it as part of your employment package. Company housing for key staff." Vernon had been skeptical. "Elvis, I can't afford much right now, even with the job you've given me." $200 a month, Elvis. That's all. Covers property taxes and insurance. You'd actually be doing us a favor by occupying it, keeping it lived in, being available for emergency calls. $200 a month was less than half what Vernon had been paying for his terrible apartment. He could afford that with his new salary and his corrected pension. What Vernon didn't know was that the $200 he paid each month went into an account Elvis had set up in Vernon's name, accumulating with interest, eventually becoming a nest egg that would go to Vernon's daughter after his death. Vernon worked at Graceland for the next 3 years, believing he was earning his keep, believing he was doing honest work for honest pay, never knowing that Elvis had created an entire support system specifically to save his dignity while saving his life. But here's what made the arrangement truly remarkable. Vernon really did work, and his work was genuinely valuable. He didn't just maintain Graceland's electrical systems, he revolutionized them. The old mansion had been experiencing frequent electrical problems, circuit breakers that tripped constantly, lights that flickered, outlets that didn't work. Vernon diagnosed issues that previous electricians had missed, rewired entire sections of the house properly, upgraded systems to handle the increased electrical load of modern equipment. Vernon doesn't just fix problems, Elvis told his staff one day. He looks at a system and sees what's going to fail before it fails. That's 40 years of experience right there. That's knowledge you can't buy. Vernon also became an informal teacher at Graceland. Young maintenance workers would watch him work, ask him questions, learn from him. Just like he'd done with Elvis 20 years before, Vernon passed on his knowledge generously, patiently, explaining the why behind every technique, the reasoning behind every decision. Marcus Johnson, a young maintenance worker at Graceland, later recalled those years working alongside Vernon. "Mr. Matthews taught me more about electrical work in 6 months than I'd learned in 2 years of trade school. But more than that, he taught me about taking pride in your work. He'd say, 'Marcus, anybody can make it work. A craftsman makes it work right.' I use that lesson every day." Elvis would sometimes watch Vernon work, standing quietly in doorways, observing the older man's careful, methodical approach to every job. He saw how Vernon treated even the smallest repair with respect, how he took the time to do things properly, rather than just quickly, how he cleaned up meticulously after every job. One day in 1976, Elvis found Vernon in the basement, rewiring an old circuit panel. Vernon was working slowly, his hands not as steady as they once were, but his knowledge and experience compensating for any physical limitation. "Vernon," Elvis said quietly, "can I ask you something?" Vernon looked up from his work. "Sure, kid. What's on your mind? Do you remember what you told me back in 1954, about honest work being all a man's got?" Vernon smiled slightly. "I remember, still believe it too. Did you mean it? I mean, really mean it?" That honest work is what matters most. Vernon put down his tools and looked at Elvis seriously. Elvis, I've watched you become the biggest star in the world. I've seen you on TV, heard you on the radio, know you've got more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. But you want to know what I'm most proud of when I think about you. What's that? That you still treat people with respect, that you remember people's names, that you don't act like you're better than anybody else. That's the honest work I was talking about, Elvis. It ain't just about electrical circuits or truck driving or whatever job you got. It's about being a decent human being, about treating people right, about staying humble no matter how high you rise. You learned that lesson, kid, and that matters more than all the gold records in the world. Elvis felt his throat tighten. Vernon, I need to tell you something. What's that? I'm grateful for what you taught me, for who you helped me become. I wanted you to know that. Vernon smiled and went back to his work. I know, kid. I know. What Elvis didn't say. What he could never say without destroying the entire careful structure he'd built. Every working-class person Elvis helped over the years. Every act of quiet generosity to electricians and plumbers and truck drivers and construction workers. Every time he stayed humble and treated people with dignity. All of it traced back to what Vernon Matthews had taught him in 1954. In late 1976, Vernon's health began to decline. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but in the quiet way that happens to men who've worked hard their whole lives. His hands shook more. His energy flagged earlier in the day. Simple jobs took longer. Elvis noticed, and it worried him. He had Graceland's doctor, the best doctor in Memphis, quietly check on Vernon, framing it as a routine health screening for all staff members. The doctor found what Elvis feared. Vernon's heart was wearing out, his blood pressure was dangerously high, and years of physical labor had taken their toll. Elvis made sure Vernon had the best medical care, the best medications, all covered through the health insurance package that came with his job at Graceland. Vernon accepted it because he believed he'd earned it through his work. He had no idea that Elvis was personally covering costs that went far beyond any standard insurance policy. Vernon Matthews passed away in his sleep on March 2, 1977, in the house Elvis had provided, surrounded by his tools and his dignity. His daughter Patricia found him in the morning, and she immediately called Graceland. Elvis came personally, spent time with Patricia, helped with all the arrangements, spoke at the funeral. But even in death, even in grief, Elvis maintained the structure of earned dignity. He didn't tell Patricia that her father's house was owned by Elvis, that the pension had been supplemented, that the job had been created specifically to save Vernon. Patricia believed her father had earned everything through his final years of honest work, which was exactly how Elvis wanted it. At the funeral, speaking to that small gathering, Elvis struggled to maintain his composure. Vernon Matthews taught me something when I was 19 years old, and I've never forgotten it. He taught me that honest work is all a man's got. That dignity comes from doing your job right. That success means nothing if you forget the people who helped you get there. Elvis paused, looking at Vernon's casket. I never forgot, Vernon. I promise you that. And I never will. 5 months later, Elvis Presley would be dead at 42, and the full story of what he'd done for Vernon Matthews would remain hidden in financial records and legal documents, unknown to the world for another 2 decades. The truth emerged gradually in the 1990s. Researchers studying Elvis's estate papers found unusual patterns in his financial records, payments to shell corporations, property purchases that didn't match his usual real estate investments, pension funds that seemed to have no connection to Elvis or his businesses. Following the paper trail led them to Vernon Matthews, and slowly, piece by piece, the entire elaborate structure Elvis had built became clear. Joe Esposito, by then an old man himself, confirmed the story when researchers approached him. Elvis never wanted anyone to know, Joe said. That was the whole point. He wasn't doing it for credit or recognition. He was doing it because Vernon had taught him something important. and this was his way of honoring that lesson. The researchers found that Vernon wasn't the only one. Elvis had created similar systems for at least 15 other working-class people who had helped him when he was poor: truck drivers, janitors, cooks, stagehands. Each one had been helped in ways that preserved their dignity, that let them believe they were earning their way rather than receiving charity. Elvis understood something that most rich people don't, said Dr. Patricia Williams, the historian who first uncovered the full extent of Elvis's hidden generosity. He understood that for working-class people, especially men like Vernon Matthews who defined themselves by their work, charity isn't just embarrassing, it's destructive. It strips away identity. Elvis found ways to help people that preserved their sense of self-worth. That's not just generosity, that's genius. Patricia Matthews, Vernon's daughter, learned the full truth about what Elvis had done for her father in 1995, 18 years after both men had died. Researchers contacted her, explained what they'd found, showed her the financial records. She was overwhelmed. "My father died believing he'd earned everything," she said through tears. "And the beautiful thing is, he did earn it. He earned it by being the kind of man who taught Elvis important lessons. He earned it by doing good work at Graceland. But Elvis created the opportunity for him to earn it. That's the most respectful thing I've ever heard of anyone doing." Patricia still has her father's work uniform from Graceland, his tools, his company patch from Memphis Power and Light. She also has photographs of her father at work, looking happy and purposeful, his dignity intact. "Elvis gave my father 3 more years of meaning," she said. 3 years of being a craftsman, of passing on knowledge, of being useful. That's a gift beyond price. The house Elvis bought for Vernon became Patricia's after Vernon's death, and she lived there until she died in 2018. In her will, she left it to her son Michael with instructions that it should remain in the family as long as possible, as a reminder of what Elvis had done and what her father had been. Michael Matthews, Vernon's grandson, still lives there today. He followed his grandfather into electrical work and is now a master electrician himself, though he never knew Vernon personally. "I grew up in this house hearing stories about Grandpa Vernon and Elvis Presley," Michael said. "But I thought they were just stories, Elvis the famous musician and his electrician. I had no idea about the rest of it until those researchers found the truth." On the garage wall of that house hangs Vernon's old company patch from Memphis Power and Light, the one he'd worn for 40 years, the one he'd shown Elvis in 1954. Beside it is Vernon's work badge from Graceland, the photograph of him teaching a young worker, and a framed copy of his final paycheck from Elvis made out for honest work, earned with dignity. "What Elvis did for my grandfather," Michael said, "was give him back his identity when the world had taken it away. Grandpa Vernon was a craftsman, a teacher, a working man who believed in earning his way. When the system failed him, when his company threw him away, Elvis created a situation where Grandpa could be those things again. That's not just charity, that's understanding who someone is and what they need to be whole." The house Elvis bought for Vernon still stands today. After Vernon's death, and then Elvis's death months later, it went to Vernon's family, who learned only then that there had never been any rent, that Elvis had paid for it outright. The family chose to keep it, and Patricia's son Vernon's grandson still lives there today. On the garage wall, encased in glass, hangs Vernon Matthews's old company patch from Memphis Power and Light, the one he'd worn for 40 years, the one he'd shown Elvis that day in 1954, and said represented dignity and honest work. Beside it is a photograph taken at Graceland in 1976, showing Vernon teaching a young electrician how to wire a circuit, passing on knowledge just like he'd passed it on to Elvis 2 decades before. The story of Elvis and Vernon Matthews has become more than just a touching anecdote about a celebrity helping someone. It's become a case study in multiple fields, in business ethics classes about corporate responsibility to long-term employees, in social work programs about dignity-preserving assistance, in psychology courses about identity and self-worth. The National Electrical Workers Association, inspired by the story, established the Vernon Matthews Award in 2001. It's presented annually to master electricians who exemplify not just technical excellence, but mentorship and dedication to passing knowledge to the next generation. The award comes with a $10,000 prize and a replica of Vernon's original Memphis Power and Light Company patch. Vernon Matthews represents something we're losing in America, said Robert Chen, president of the NUA, at the first award ceremony. He represents the craftsman who takes pride in his work, who sees his job as a calling, who believes that how you do your work says something about who you are as a person. We give this award to remind ourselves that those values still matter. Recipients of the award often don't know the full story behind Vernon's name when they first receive it. But when they learn it, many are moved to tears. Thomas Washington, the 2015 recipient, said at his acceptance speech, "I thought I was getting an award for being a good electrician. Instead, I learned a story about dignity, about loyalty, and about what it means to truly help someone." Vernon Matthews didn't just teach Elvis Presley about wiring circuits, he taught him about being human. And Elvis returned that lesson by making sure Vernon never lost his humanity when the system failed him. At Graceland today, in the staff areas not usually seen by tourists, there's a small memorial to Vernon Matthews. It includes his photograph, his work badge, and a plaque that reads Vernon Matthews, Master Electrician, 1912 to 1977. He taught us that honest work is all a man's got, and that dignity comes from doing your job right. Never forget where you came from. Tour guides at Graceland sometimes mention Vernon to visitors who express interest in the property's electrical systems. Our electrical system was modernized in the 1970s by Vernon Matthews, who was one of Memphis's finest electricians, they say. Most tourists just nod and move on. But occasionally, someone recognizes the name and asks for more details, and the guides share the remarkable story of the electrician who taught Elvis about honest work, and the student who made sure his teacher never regretted the lesson. The broader impact of Vernon's story has been felt in unexpected places. In 2010, a group of construction workers in Detroit, who were facing layoffs after decades of loyal service, formed an organization called the Vernon Matthews Coalition. They advocated for better treatment of long-term workers, for pension protection, for dignity in retirement. Their symbol was a company work patch, just like the one Vernon had treasured. "We're all Vernon Matthews," said coalition founder James Miller. "We're all workers who gave our best years to companies, who believed that loyalty and hard work would be rewarded, who now face the possibility of being discarded when we're no longer seen as cost-effective." Vernon's story reminds us that there are still people who value what we do, who understand that our work has dignity. And it reminds us to fight for that dignity. In the world of philanthropy, Vernon's story has influenced how major donors approach giving. The Matthews model, as it's sometimes called, emphasizes preserving dignity over simply providing funds. It asks, how can we help people in ways that allow them to maintain their identity and self-respect? How can we create opportunities rather than just giving handouts? Jennifer Lopez, who teaches philanthropy at Stanford University, uses Vernon's case in her classes. What Elvis did for Vernon Matthews should be the gold standard for charitable giving, she tells her students. He understood that Vernon's identity was tied to being a craftsman, a working man who earned his way. So Elvis created a situation where Vernon could earn with dignity. That's infinitely more valuable than just giving someone money. It's about understanding who people are and what they need to maintain their sense of self. The house where Vernon lived his final years has become something of an unofficial landmark. While it's not open to the public, people who know the story sometimes drive by, take photographs from the street, leave notes. Michael Matthews, who still lives there, has collected hundreds of these notes over the years. People write about their own Vernon Matthews stories. Michael explained. Teachers who helped them, coaches who believed in them, bosses who took a chance on them. They write about wanting to pay it forward, about wanting to help their mentors the way Elvis helped my grandfather. It's become this symbol of gratitude and respect for the people who shape it. One note, left by a woman named Sarah Chen in 2018, read, My high school shop teacher, Mr. Rodriguez, taught me that good work matters. He stayed late to help me learn, never charged me for materials, believed I could be an engineer when everyone else said girls couldn't do it. I'm an engineer now, successful, but Mr. Rodriguez died poor and alone. I wish I had known about Vernon's story in time. I wish I had understood that success means making sure your mentors know they mattered. Thank you for reminding us. Elvis's approach to helping Vernon has also influenced how some corporations think about their responsibility to long-term employees. A technology company facing the need to lay off older workers created what they called the Matthews program. Instead of simply laying off experienced employees, they created consulting roles that allowed these workers to transition with dignity, using their expertise to train younger employees while maintaining income and benefits. We were inspired by what Elvis did for Vernon, said the company's CEO. We realized we didn't have to choose between business efficiency and human dignity. We could find ways to honor the contributions of our long-term employees while also moving forward. It's more expensive in the short term, but it's the right thing to do. And it turns out it's also good for morale and knowledge transfer. The lessons from Vernon Matthews extend beyond just workplace issues. They touch on fundamental questions about how society treats people who have given their best years to serving others, about the value we place on experience and wisdom, about what we owe to the people who helped us become who we are. In Memphis technical schools, Vernon's story is taught as part of the curriculum. Young electricians learn about circuit diagrams and safety protocols. But they also learn about Vernon Matthews, about taking pride in your work, about passing knowledge to the next generation, about maintaining dignity regardless of circumstance. Vernon Matthews is our patron saint, joked instructor David Williams at Memphis Technical College. But seriously, his story represents everything we try to teach our students about being not just good electricians, but good people. The technical skills anybody can learn, the character, the pride in craftsmanship, the belief that your work matters. That's what separates a technician from a craftsman. That's what Vernon had, and that's what we try to pass on. Today, more than 45 years after Vernon's death and Elvis's death, their story continues to resonate because it addresses something fundamental in human experience: the need to feel valued, the desire to maintain dignity, the importance of remembering those who helped us. Professor Michael Jordan at the Memphis Technical College uses the story in his electrical training program. What Elvis understood, Professor Jordan tells his students, was that Vernon didn't need pity. He needed opportunity. He needed his dignity preserved. He needed to believe that his skills still had value. Elvis created that opportunity in a way that allowed Vernon to keep his self-respect while getting the help he needed. That's not just generosity, that's wisdom. The story also serves as a reminder of a darker reality, that the system often fails loyal workers like Vernon Matthews. Men and women who give decades of their lives to companies, who do honest work and play by the rules, can still find themselves discarded when they're no longer seen as cost-effective. Labor historian Dr. Sarah Martinez has studied cases like Vernon's extensively. Vernon Matthews' story was repeated millions of times across America in the 1970s and continues today. Dr. Martinez explains, loyal, skilled workers are laid off because younger, cheaper workers are available. Pensions that were promised turn out to be inadequate. People who believed in the American dream find themselves betrayed by it. Elvis's intervention saved one man, but it also highlights a system that shouldn't require individual acts of rescue to ensure that workers can retire with dignity. Today, the lessons from Vernon Matthews live on in unexpected ways. The National Electrical Workers Association presents an annual Vernon Matthews Award to master electricians who exemplify mentorship and dedication to passing on knowledge to younger workers. Recipients of the award often don't know the full story behind Vernon's name, but they understand what it represents: honest work, dedication to craft, and the importance of teaching the next generation. At Graceland, in the staff areas not usually seen by tourists, there's a small plaque that reads, "In memory of Vernon Matthews, Master Electrician, who taught us that honest work is all a man's got. Never forget where you came from." Vernon's grandson, Michael Matthews, followed in his grandfather's footsteps and became an electrician, He knew Vernon in his final years and remembers him as a happy man, proud of his work, content with his life. My grandfather used to tell me stories about teaching Elvis Presley how to wire circuits, Michael recalls. He'd say, "That boy went on to change the world, but he never forgot that honest work is what mattered." What Grandpa didn't know, what we didn't know until years later, was that Elvis had literally saved his life by giving him back his dignity. That's the kind of thing you don't forget. That's the kind of legacy that matters. The story of Elvis and Vernon Matthews reminds us that true success isn't measured in wealth or fame, but in whether we remember the people who helped us along the way. It shows us that the greatest gifts are often given in ways that preserve the dignity of the recipient. And it proves that the lessons we learn from our mentors aren't just about skills or knowledge. They're about character, about values, about what kind of person we choose to be when we have the power to help others. Somewhere in Memphis today, there's a young electrician learning the trade from an older master electrician, just like Elvis learned from Vernon, just like Vernon taught so many others. And maybe, if we're lucky, that young electrician will remember the lesson when success comes their way. Honest work is all we've got, and we should never forget the people who taught us that truth. Vernon Matthews taught Elvis Presley how to wire a circuit, but more importantly, he taught him how to be a man who never forgets where he came from. And Elvis proved, through decades of quiet generosity to working-class people who had helped him, that he had learned that lesson well. In the end, that's what the story is really about. Not just the kindness of helping someone in need, but the wisdom of doing it in a way that honors who they are and what they believe about themselves. Vernon Matthews died believing he had earned his place through honest work, which was exactly the truth, because Elvis had understood that giving Vernon the opportunity to earn was worth more than just giving him money. That's the kind of lesson that lasts forever. That's the kind of story that reminds us what really matters. And that's why, nearly 50 years after both men are gone, we're still talking about the electrician who taught the king about honest work, and the king who made sure his teacher never regretted teaching him.